Hey everyone, welcome back to Coral Currents. I'm your host, Shay, an early career scientist obsessed with reefs and figuring out how to work with them someday. This show is all about spotlighting the coolest ways experts are tackling coral restoration. Think cutting edge tech and fresh ideas making real waves. Today, I'm stoked to chat with Dr. Orion McCarthy, a marine ecologist who's killing it with photogrammetry, 3D reef mapping that's changing the game, and science lead at Sea Trees, working with communities to save corals from Hawaii to the Virgin Islands. We're diving into how this tech helps reefs bounce back and what got Orion hooked onto this field. I'm all about connecting with pros like him, not just for me, but so you can hear the latest, whether you're an ocean nerd, an expert keeping up with new tools, or someone who'd rather listen rather than dig through all the research papers. Plus, pro tip, reach out to folks like Orion yourself. Ask questions, show interest, and who knows what doors might open. Let's get into it. What got you into photogrammetry? Did you just realize that you loved being in the ocean so much and that was like an outlet? Or did somebody inspire you?
Yeah, I guess getting involved with photogrammetry was a bit of happenstance. I was looking at different graduate programs to focus on coral reef ecology and conservation, and Scripps Institution of Oceanography was at the top of my radar, partly because of the amazing technology, the work that they do, especially as someone coming from outside of the lab to really get a comprehensive understanding of the type of reefs they go to, the type of research they do, because they had a bunch of videos of all the places they'd been and the 3D models of those coral reefs. And so you really got a chance to connect visually with those reefs in a way that I didn't so much when I was just reading a lab website. And I think that definitely speaks to the power of photogrammetry to help people connect with these ecosystems. And that is partly what drew me into Scripps. And then also from a research perspective, being excited about getting to sort of participate in the cutting edge side of photogrammetry research, to get to virtually visit a bunch of reefs and to visit reefs in person too. But even though I've gotten to go to some cool places and go diving, I've been able to visit many, many more reefs in many other parts of the world just by opening a 3D model on a computer. And that really contributes as an ecologist to your understanding of patterns, of how coral reefs vary across space and through time. And I've really appreciated getting that perspective that is afforded through this technology.
And I guess that led into how much you focus on like long-term monitoring. Yeah, I thought it was really neat how you got to visit so many different areas and got such a good, well-rounded perspective, different reefs, how they're reacting.
Yeah, the long-term monitoring is so crucial for a lot of different ecosystems, but coral reefs especially, because even though they are being impacted by climate change and that change is rapid in a
Hmm.
sense, it still, from the naked eye, is not always the most apparent. And corals take a while to grow. They usually can decline pretty quickly, but that recovery piece, the corals growing back, can take some time. And if we only do research studies that span 1 to 2 years, we might not fully catch that recovery. If we look at the first 2 years of a project, we might say, oh, look, the corals are doing great. But if you monitor over a longer period of time, that's when you might start to see, oh, this bleaching event came in and the corals didn't do so well, or there's
Yeah.
this slow chronic stressor that they initially had this strong recovery and then it tapered off. So those dynamics that play out over sort of multiple years to decades, those are really what shape reef trajectory over time. And with these snapshots, it could be really hard to say definitively how a reef is doing, and we might use
Mhm.
that data and make decisions that are not really reflecting reality if we don't have that time component.
And by the way, I found it necessary to include, for those of you who don't know, change over time. It's a kind of analysis that scientists use in photogrammetry, and it means capturing a reef's 3D structure to track its health and growth over months or years. For reef restoration specifically, it's key, showing exactly how corals recover, where they're thriving, or where efforts need a boost. So then how does photogrammetry capture that essence of change in the most efficient way then? Like if you were to be just a regular diver out in the ocean going out there every day to try to analyze change, how is photogrammetry, for one, saving some time, but also allowing you to observe more?
Yeah,
Um,
those are great points. I think it saves you time because you don't have to, in that moment, decide everything you want to capture about the ecosystem. You're just taking pictures and you're creating as complete a reconstruction as those pictures can. And then maybe someone will come down the line and have a very specific question that you didn't think of when you were in the water. If the data is shared, it's helping to democratize access to reefs, both sort of as they exist now and backwards in time. So yeah, so I will say, even as a trained coral reef ecologist, when I go out in the water, there are certain types of changes that I might not pick up on if I'm just seeing the reef at a single snapshot in time. One
mhm.
good example from the research I did in Maui is there was a site we went to in 2023 that I was actually in the field with some research partners that I was training in photogrammetry. And the first step in doing these surveys is to find your site. And I was sort of had made it seem like it was going to be super easy because this site had one really characteristic coral in the middle of it. And we hopped in the water and I could not find the site. It was just the coral was missing. I was all disoriented. And it turns out that there was a big wave event that had come through since the previous time we had been there. It actually took this coral that was about, I don't know, 4 or 5 feet across and tossed it off of the reef.
Wow. Those waves have that energy,
Yeah, and it
yeah.
was only about in 10 feet of water, and the waves were probably almost that tall. So it was really, it's come in and
Wow.
scour the reef. And as an ecologist, it was pretty apparent when I was underwater that something had happened. There had been some amount of wave damage. But it was only after we made the 3D model and layered it on top of the model from 2 years earlier that we were able to see not only how much damage there was, but the damage was actually concentrated along these sand channels, because as the water's getting sort of scoured out by those waves, it's getting concentrated in those channels. So it wasn't even just that there was wave damage, but learning
Ah.
ecologically how that damage is manifesting on the reef was really interesting. And so I think
Mhm,
that is an example where, yes, the immediate observation that there was wave damage was obvious from just being in the water, but that
mhm.
additional layer of learning was made possible because of the 3D models and me being able to show people how the waves damaged the reef. People who weren't there with me in the water that day, that is also possible because of photogrammetry.
It
That's
tells
a great
you.
question. So we do two things normally. We have some permanent stakes that are hammered into the reef
Okay.
that help to orient us when we get down there. But you still
Mhm.
have to be able to get close enough to really be able to pick that up. And especially when they get overgrown with algae or maybe even some corals, they can be a little bit hard to find.
Definitely.
We have a sort of top-down 2D version of the 3D model that we print on underwater paper. And we take that when we first jump off the boat, we can have that as a reference. And it's actually pretty easy to see from the surface if there's a sand channel or distinctive coral. It's because you're sort of at the same level that you would be if you were viewing that 3D model from above. It translates really well to snorkeling at the
Huh.
surface. And then you can sort of have an idea of where you need to descend down on the reef. And more times than not, you descend down and you're like right on top of that marker. So
Oh,
it's a
wow.
pretty efficient way to have this mental picture in your head of what the reef should look like, and then you hop in the water, and there it is, and you just dive right down to it.
Yeah, that's brilliant. That would save a lot of time. I'm just imagining, going down and being like, "Okay, where is that huge reef?" And it's just, like, gone, and
Yeah, and that
yeah.
happens. There we have one set of sites that I haven't worked on, but that are in Tonga that actually
Mm.
got completely destroyed. even with all the stakes in the reef in the world and prior
Yeah.
models, like sometimes things happen in nature, and you just won't be able to go back or find the site again. And I
Yeah.
mean, there's having this baseline through the 100 Island Challenge that is worldwide. We're going to start picking up on these types of disturbance events, some of which are fairly common, unfortunately, like bleaching, but some that are somewhat rare, whether it's like a ship grounding or a volcano or giant wave damage, like I was describing in Maui. Also, start to compare the impact of these big disturbances geographically and see how recovery differs in different parts of the world.
I know a lot of your career, it seems like you have been focused on um, applying technology like this to conservation efforts,
Yeah,
which
that's
is
the sweet
just,
spot. Hopefully, more people start working in that direction. So I think there is
mhm,
a lot of conservation value add from technology like this, as long
yeah,
as we
absolutely.
um, think about things like making sure everyone can have access to it.
Do you have maybe off the top of your head one or two different organizations that either you know are utilizing this really well or that maybe you inspired to utilize this technology for conservation or just for research, honestly, because they're both just as important for each other?
Yeah, I mean, through my work in Maui, we were the whole time I was working there, we were collaborating really closely with the Natural Resource Agency through the state of Hawaii, which is called the Division
Um,
of Aquatic Resources. And so was at the beginning was working with them mostly just in a they had monitoring sites, we had monitoring sites. They kind of overlapped. Sometimes we would coordinate, but they weren't doing photogrammetry, and that was fine. They had their own way of doing things. And then
mhm.
over the years, got to work closer with them, and each time we would go out, it was sort of a little bit of lifting the veil of photogrammetry and doing a little bit of training. So there was
Huh.
we would do on the beach, dry sides, you can talk to each other. We would set up like a fake plot to do photogrammetry. And so practicing like when you're underwater and you can't talk to each other, what is the sequence of steps and where do you have to go? And
Yeah.
then the next year we did that again, and we also brought them out on some dives and they got to practice setting up the plot in person. And then the next year they came out a little bit more and actually used the cameras. And then this last summer went out with them and used their boat, and we imaged all of our sites and all of their sites using the cameras to do photogrammetry, and then also had some training sessions on the computer back at their office. This is how, once the 3D model is built, how you would analyze it. One of the keys in conservation is those sort of sustained partnerships and collaboration, where it is over multiple years of relationship building and partnership that you can really make that meaningful progress. Again,
Mhm.
steering away from projects that are just sort of 1 year in duration and then you move on.
It's like it's not just like the one project. It's really interesting actually to me because learning how to communicate with each other on land first, not just person to person, but then also with your type of science, so important. Just then, you've gotten possibly a lifelong relationship with somebody that can call on or maybe bounce ideas off of each other with all the new projects you start. That community is really what is going to save us, I think, in reality, with
Yeah.
any type of conservation.
And I think
Reef,
then they become
yeah.
more invested in the research, and you have to make a bunch of commitments and decisions to shift over your monitoring approaches. And so I think that seeing everything that was possible through the data we were collecting was one of those motivating factors for them. And now hopefully they're in the position that this coming field season they can largely lead those efforts, and maybe with just one person from our lab going out and helping. And so it's really we're getting towards that exciting stage of the partnership where they are getting closer and closer to being self-sufficient.
That's awesome. So that hits a lot of points on the pieces for conservation, education, public engagement.
One other story, I guess
Yeah.
plugging Sea Trees where I currently work. So
Right.
we focus on helping small community-led projects sort of level up their restoration efforts, and we have a partnership with Samsung to use their Galaxy phones to take pictures underwater and then upload those pictures and get those constructed to a 3D model. So a little bit easier,
Okay.
more accessible tech to be able to do photogrammetry. And so that project is exciting. It's going on in multiple different parts of the world, including Fiji and Florida. And the goal is to eventually have an app that can be on the phone where anyone could go out and snap a bunch of pictures. They get uploaded through the cloud and then built into a 3D model that we can use for research or conservation purposes. So really helping to get over that hump of this being a more academic technology that is not broadly accessible, and trying to eliminate some of those technical barriers so that more people have access. That's beyond that specific partnership. That's a big problem that photogrammetry and a lot of other forms of conservation technology have. And so it's really trying to mean that we can both have the advanced technology that allows us to learn new things, but not be excluding different types of people from conservation because they don't have the resources or technical expertise to use that technology.
Yeah.
There,
Well, who was that in collaboration with again? You said it was with NOAA or
So that project with Samsung is with
Samsung?
Sea Trees and then Scripps and UC San Diego. And
Okay.
then, but during my PhD, there was a project that I was working on, particularly around the accessibility of photogrammetry. And we did like a survey where we asked a bunch of restoration folks and other conservation practitioners if they had used photogrammetry, if they wanted to in the future, if they hadn't used it, why, and what barriers they faced. And we were able to come up with some pretty useful recommendations for ways that scientists who are already using photogrammetry can, like steps they can take to
Yeah.
try to make that technology more accessible. And at Reef Futures in December, the Coral Reef Restoration Conference, I was really encouraged by seeing how many people, even in like poster sessions, how widespread photogrammetry was becoming. So I think more and more people are being able to get over those initial hurdles. And there was a really great 2-day workshop there that was highlighting some of the latest advances, and also what some of the remaining challenges are. And it was just a really great time to, there was even like demos where people could walk around and ask some of the like leading researchers who are pushing the latest developments in software and photogrammetry and ask them questions.
Oh, wow.
And there's a lot of resources that have been developed to like estimate how much it might cost to get a photogrammetry monitoring system started, and
Hmm.
just lots of focus on making it more accessible, which was really encouraging to see.
Out of curiosity, too, to do a full blown 3D modeling session, what are you looking at? Do you have packages? What's the price point and stuff?
Yeah, there is can be a little bit challenging to estimate because there's different SOPs or workflows out there that
Yeah.
people use. And there was a really great guide that came out in summer of 2023 that has, instead of going into the details following one particular approach, it sort of lays out the best practices and like what are the fundamental principles when you're making a 3D model and what is required. The end of it, it has, I believe, 6 examples of the different institutions have developed to do their photogrammetry monitoring. So it is a bit of a make your own adventure sort of thing. Costs like cameras would be, if it's GoPros, maybe in the hundreds of dollars. If it's DSLR cameras, maybe in the thousands. And then there's
Hmm.
going to be underwater housings for those cameras, which can also be on the expensive side. For Scripps Institution of Oceanography, we have a frame that the cameras get attached to. There's also scale bars because you need to have something that when you're taking the pictures, there can be something with a known length in those pictures. So you're able to add that later and say, this is how far a meter is or half a meter. And then the whole 3D model has some sort of scale to it. Those aren't particularly expensive. Similarly, there's some depth tiles or calibration tiles, you put those out to sort of mark the boundaries or corners of where you're imaging, but then also you can measure the depth using a dive computer at those locations. And then later you can input that information in the computer and you know if the reef is sort of flat or if it's on a slope.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, so those are the main costs from a field perspective. But I feel like those costs actually, if you're trying to start up a research program, are actually on the um, sort of minor end. The real challenge if you want to extract data from photogrammetry, at least currently, is a lot of the workflows require a lot of person time to go through and click on different pictures and analyze corals or manually trace boundaries. And there are a lot of advances that are leveraging AI and machine learning to help expedite that process. But given that the rate of change on a coral reef, especially year to year, we might really care about just a percent change in coral cover. We want to make sure we have enough confidence to capture that change. And so we need to have, at this point, still a person involved. We can have sort of AI to get you part of the way, but then a person to help get you to that final high confidence that we can be measuring these fine scale changes that we care about. You need to have a dedicated staff person going through and building your 3D models and analyzing all the imagery. That very quickly is an order of magnitude higher cost than the few $1,000s to buy that initial camera equipment. And then there's
Yeah.
the longer term considerations around storing your data, especially if you're
Hmm.
like Scripps and have a 100 island challenge project where each island has maybe 10 sites and you're going back there multiple times. And quickly you're at not just gigabytes, but terabytes and even petabytes of data. Yeah.
Yeah, being able to access everything, right? Oh, yeah. What what was that one coral I was looking at site D? It's like, oh my gosh, I can imagine that gets complicated.
And the curse of having a lot of data.
Yeah, yeah,
But
totally.
thankfully, we're not the only field that is dealing with that challenge. Like we're living in the era of big data, and I think there needs to be
Yes.
more learning from each other and sharing lessons
Yeah, that way
learned
you
and
can have
approaches.
it all kind of like uniform, like that's an important part I think I was mentioning somewhere about cloud configurations,
Mhm.
like making everything sort of like a framework, which I know everybody is constantly coming out with research papers on how to make things more within a framework so that everybody can upload it and it's all data points that everybody is using so you can collaborate better. I wanted to kind of touch on your experience with Brief Futures too a little
Mhm.
more, but as far as this cloud that you have for 3D data, um,
It's still very much a work in progress. I think it's something that you bring up a good point about standardization. I think there is definitely photogrammetry lends itself to that a little bit more than traditional coral reef ecology, to the point I was mentioning before, where you don't have to have a specific metric that is standardized across the whole coral reef community. You just have to have everyone agree to take pictures, and then people
yeah,
can pull their pet metric
huh,
out of that, but everyone has access to the same
totally.
pictures. So that is a step in the right direction. I think the challenge is we need to agree on a sort of way to share those pictures in what sort of format, whether it's a specific platform or like a metaverse for corals or
Yeah.
something else, but definitely a way that this data, because it is sort of big, bulky data, even the photos themselves, but especially when you get to the 3D models, if there's different file formats and things like that, it can be harder to be able to share that sort of data very quickly and easily between organizations. So getting over that big data challenge. And a lot of that, I think, will require cloud computing. So you don't have to be manually either uploading or downloading large sets of photos. And especially in the places where a lot of coral reef science and conservation is conducted, in like islands in the tropics where things break down really quickly. And it's hard to expect a coral reef practitioner to have a bunch of their photos backed up locally, whether it's on hard drives or all of that burden falling in that one place. So if there can be some sort of centralized repository where people can upload their data, and especially once AI and machine learning get brought into it more and more, where you can basically upload your data and then like you get data products back pretty easily and quickly. I think that's the vision that a lot of people in the photogrammetry research space, especially in conservation, are really trying to push towards.
Hmm.
It's definitely a work in progress though, and actively pursuing funding to try to make that happen.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So what from Brave Futures did you hear about some of the biggest hurdles too that they're facing right now?
Yeah, I mean, Reef Futures was quite a conference in that some people were very hopeful and talking about scaling up and like the world is our oyster, everything's at our fingertips. And then other people who are taking a very sort of informed by experience of the last few years, especially in the Caribbean view of like we need to take a step back and reevaluate like what are we really doing after
Yeah,
like 2 years of massive back-to-back bleaching events and just sort of questioning um, sort of the underlying strategy around restoration and not should we do
absolutely.
it or
Yeah.
not, but should we be envisioning a different and
Yeah, what
finish.
should we like focus on right now that's going to make the biggest effect kind of thing?
Yeah. Yeah, and so I think both of those things can be true. I think we're rapidly getting closer to being able to scale up both our monitoring efforts and our actual restoration efforts, but we need to still make sure that, but one, that we don't get discouraged, but also that we are trying to design those efforts as much as possible to be responsive to our climate reality and the future that coral reefs are facing. And even recognizing that maybe changing the goalposts and finish line maybe might be necessary in some locations rather than others. And not to say to give up on certain locations, but for example, in the Caribbean, we might need to be accepting of sort of a certain level of coral cover or species diversity at a different threshold than elsewhere in the world.
You know, that brings me to such an interesting point. In conservation, you have even those that are a little bit more defeated. They're always trying to reconfigure, like a reboot. Yeah, there's just other areas that I think we should expand on. And it's never like, you know what, guys, let's just throw in the towel. We did our best. What is your opinion on that outlook of accepting defeat? What is the problem with just deciding to give up and moving on to other research when corals are such a keystone species
Yeah,
in the
I mean,
ocean?
we all care about coral reefs so much, and we know how important they are to so many people around the world. And I think that's why you don't see, like, even though there might be different sides to the debate within the coral reef space of like climate's the only thing we have to focus on. Let's not talk about the rays of hope and just focus on getting people to stop climate change. Versus people being like, you need to change the messaging, you need to focus on how like areas where there are success and focus in on that and try to replicate it elsewhere. But everyone in that community agrees that coral reefs are important, and we're going to keep trying to work to make sure that they stick around as long as they can. And I mean, coral reefs are like, not only are they interesting from a research perspective, also super important to marine life. 1 in 4 species in the ocean spend some portion of their life cycle on a coral reef. It's also so many coastal communities throughout the tropics that live near a coral reef, depend on them for food, that those coral reefs protect them from big storms, which are only going to become more frequent. So it's really about trying to make sure that all of those benefits of coral reefs can persist. And that's part of the reason why you see people when they hit an obstacle or a roadblock, they rather than giving up, they pivot and try to figure out, okay, well, if that's not going to work, or if we need to reimagine what coral reefs might look like in the future, how can we do that in a way that isn't just giving up?
I love that. I love to hear people's perspectives or how they would word that. I just see a lot of doom and gloom nowadays with any type of environmentalism.
It's definitely a threading the needle because you need to make it clear how urgent of a problem it is. Like we need to acknowledge at the outset that like solving climate change is key for us keeping coral reefs around. But then very quickly pivot over to this is why there is still hope. This is why we need to take action. These are the things that we can do, the specific areas we can focus in on and actually make actionable progress so
Hmm.
that it doesn't quickly become this too big existential crisis that we feel like is bad but can't actually be solved and then sort of give up.
Yeah, that's because that's the problem, right? Like, I think it's having that balance of, wow, look how beautiful these reefs are that do still exist. You know, in America, especially, I'm convinced that 90% of the population thinks that all of the reefs are dead.
Yeah, and that's the problem when you're constantly saying that the Great Barrier Reef is gone, that ringing the alarm bells, and then people as terrible as it sounds, they accept that and they move on. And I've had multiple
Hmm.
people be like, "Oh, why are you studying coral reefs? Aren't all the corals already dead? Like,
Yeah. Yeah.
is there any hope?" And people really approach it with this really like doom and gloom mindset that, again, this is coming out of a place of people loving coral reefs and wanting to ring that alarm bell so that the rest of the world wakes up and takes it seriously, but just not thinking through all the steps after that of how that gets perceived and how that leads to public opinion and that sort of thing. So I think it's definitely, again, I think everyone in the coral reef community is coming from the same place of wanting to keep these ecosystems around. So it's just a matter of trying to hone in the messaging so that other people hear it as well.
Oh, that's wonderful. Wonderful wrap up to this episode as well. The very last point I'd like to make, how can listeners make an impact themselves? And
Mhm.
what makes a big effect to you is what I'm curious about.
Like individual actions are a little bit hard with coral reefs because a lot of people in the world, as much as I was saying, people live near coral reefs and millions of people depend on them. There's a lot of people, particularly people in the States who might be listening to this who do not live close to a coral reef, and your everyday actions from like using reef safe sunscreen or eating fish or wastewater pollution, like those all matter if you live on an island that has coral reefs. But if you live far away from coral reefs, those are not having an impact generally. I mean, if you're buying fish that come from that part of the world, then they will, but most people are not eating reef fish.
Right.
So,
Right.
but I think the broader challenge again is climate change. And then there's this debate around, is it more individual actions or do you need a whole shift in how society gets its energy and resources and interacts with the climate? And I believe it's more the second. I think we learned during COVID, even when everyone stayed home and people
Hmm.
didn't fly anywhere, it's not like carbon emissions suddenly went away. There's still a certain level of baseline emissions that are baked into the way we live in society, which is why we need to get our energy from more climate friendly sources and change sort of that foundation of how our society functions so that we can have a lower impact. And that'll be key not only for the future of coral reefs, but just for the future of our planet.
Hmm.
Whatever steps as individuals we can take to move towards that goal, which in a lot of ways rely on keeping climate as a priority in how you vote and in our sort of political discourse and just regular discourse in society. And it's been frustrating to watch it progress at a very slow pace. It feels like some
Hmm.
ways we're still back in the early 2000s where we've gone back to debating if climate change is really a thing,
Right.
which I thought we had moved past that, but I guess we're back.
And I think people are just really concerned about the human induced part of it. I think it's really hard for people to recognize or accept the fate
Mhm.
that humans have a bad effect, a negative effect on anything, really. It's this guilty conscious thing that I think we've been running from
Yeah.
for a long time.
I think it makes it hard. There's a lot of inertia to getting started, but the longer we wait to get started, the harder it's going to be. I was using this analogy recently to explain it of it's like saving for retirement. If you wait until you're 50 to start, it's going to be so hard. You can make some progress, but by the time you actually do retire, you're probably going to retire late. And then when you do retire, you're not going to have this great quality of life because you haven't been able to save as much as opposed to if you just start when you're 20 and you save a little bit and you're set. Now imagine if instead of that 401k or whatever being something that you personally get to tap into when you turn 65, it's your children or your grandchildren or like people who are generations down the line. And even though climate change is going to impact us in our lifetime, it is those future generations that are really going to pay the price. And we have people in power now who they're already close to tapping into their 401k. And it's like there's all the incentives are built in to continue the sort of short-term focus. And I understand that we can't suddenly turn off all fossil fuels overnight. There would be sort of economic collapse and calamity, but we need to get over that initial inertia and start making progress. Otherwise, we're going to wait till it's too late. And it's going to be the amount of change that we need to stave off disaster is just going to be too fast. to be able to actually implement on a societal level.
I've been really into training animals as I've grown up since I was a kid, and it kind of relates to that. If you were to train a horse, or a dog, and then wait until it's biting people to be like, this is a problem, we need to
Yes.
solve this, then you're like, well, that's a bad dog now,
Yeah, it's sort of baked in now.
Yeah, and it takes so much more work at that point, like you said. So just a funny analogy. I think I need to use more analogies that lock into people's brain differently, I think,
Yeah.
when it
And I
comes to
think
this kind
right
of
now,
conversation.
for the finance analogy, I think right now we're like in our early 40s and we haven't really been saving for retirement. We might have been putting in just a little bit here and there. And we can always look back and be like, well, damn it, if I had started in my early 20s, things would have been fine. But like 42 is still a better time to start saving for retirement than waiting till you're 60.
That concludes episode 3, part 1, with Dr. Orion McCarthy. And next week, be looking out on Friday for part 2 with Dr. Orion's PhD journey. We'll be going into his more specific research with conservation technology, long-term data monitoring, and his case studies on the Maui coral reefs. But today, we looked into exploring photogrammetry and its impact on coral resilience. I hope you found his insights as inspiring as I did. If you enjoyed this discussion, please consider subscribing to Coral Currents podcast to stay updated. Visit our website as well. You can explore the guests page for information on past and incoming speakers. We've got links for their LinkedIn and particular portfolios or websites that they have there as well. We encourage you to submit content suggestions on the homepage and ask questions. If you also email coralcurrentspodcast@gmail.com, we can update you for weekly content and just let you know who's coming up on the podcast, what we've talked about, and how to get involved with ocean advocacy. We encourage your input to foster an ongoing community conversation about reef restoration and conservation. Thank you so much for listening, and I look forward to our next episode.